Russia's plans indicate their final transition to the principles of using assault groups as the basis for warfare. This was stated by Andriy Kovalenko, head of the Center for Countering Disinformation at the National Security and Defense Council. According to the head of the Center for Countering Disinformation at the National Security and Defense Council, the Russians are trying to increase recruitment for contracts, including luring conscripts and foreigners. In addition, the Russian army is relying more on motorcycles, buggies, and other vehicles instead of armored vehicles. They are doing all this because in kill zones, armor and people are quickly destroyed by drones, and the only way to pass a zone of 5 to 15 kilometers is on such transport. But there are enough drones now to burn such scooter riders. However, similar plans, which Belousov announces in the Russian Federation, indicate the final transition of the Russians to the principles of using assault groups as the basis for war. The Post says. According to Andriy Kovalenko, this is not critical. Enemy assault groups are operating in the east. They are being destroyed. On the contrary, the Russians are striving to reduce their losses. In general, the mass use of drones, especially those with artificial intelligence, will finally change the role of infantry in war. It seems that this will happen next year, Kovalenko added. He noted that all actions of the Russians indicate that they do not plan to end the war. The West, I hope, understands this, and they plan to wage war not only against us, summarized the head of the Center for Countering Disinformation at the National Security and Defense Council. According to the analysis, while Russia can replenish its troop numbers through aggressive recruitment, its defensive industry cannot produce new tanks and fighting vehicles fast enough to replace staggering battlefield losses, which have exceeded 20,000 units. Having already depleted its best Soviet-era stockpiles, the Russian army is now resorting to meet assaults with unarmored civilian vehicles, a desperate tactic that highlights a fatal flaw in its war-fighting capability and signals a coming crisis. There are still many older Russian vehicles left in some storage yards, but many of these are even older than those that have been mobilized. Satellite analysis shows that some, if not most, of what remains in these Russian storage yards are armored vehicles that have not moved in years. At current costs, refurbishing them is not financially feasible. They are little more than scrap metal. Russia's budgetary expenditures on the war in Ukraine in the first half of 2025 set a new record of 8.484 trillion rubles. This is according to Yanis Klug, a researcher at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, who calculated the figures based on data from the Russian Finance Ministry. The Moscow Times reports, compared to the same period last year, spending on the army and weapons production increased by 31%. Compared to January to June 2023 by 95%, and if compared with the first year of the war, 3 times, according to Klug's calculations. On average, the war machine ate 1.4 trillion rubles per month and 46.9 billion rubles per day, an amount exceeding the annual budgets of poor Russian regions, 28.8 billion rubles, in Kalmykia, 30.5 billion rubles, in Karachay-Cherkessia, 42.7 billion rubles in the Altai Republic. The share of military expenditures of the treasury also broke the record. Last year it was 35%, and this year it was 41.2% in the first quarter and 39.8% at the end of the second. Of the budget revenues, 50.1% went to the war in January to March and 48.2% by the end of June. In other words, The government spent every second ruble collected from taxpayers in the federal treasury on the army and weapons purchases. Almost two-thirds of 62% of the military budget in Russia is classified, according to Klug's estimates. 3.203 trillion rubles was spent on open defense items in 6 months, and 5.281 trillion on shadow ones. Over the year, the secret budget increased by 41%, and almost 4 times compared to January to June of the first year of the war. In 2022 to 2024, the government spent more than 2 trillion rubles on the army and state defense orders, and the 2025 budget included another 13.5 trillion rubles under the national defense item. 30% of all expenses, or a record share since the Soviet Union. Taking into account the national security item, which includes the budgets of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the Russian National Guard, the Investigative Committee, and the Special Services, the security forces were allocated about 40% of the Treasury's expenses, or 8% of GDP. But the actual amount will be even higher, a government source told Reuters. Even if peace talks in Ukraine are successful, the Kremlin does not plan to cut military spending in 2026. The agency's source said shells and drones will still need to be made, although on a slightly smaller scale. The confrontation will continue. The army and weapons spending will be higher because the West is also increasing them. If the active phase of hostilities ends, the military budget may decrease from 2027, although we should not expect a reduction to the levels that were before 2022, the Reuters source emphasized. Ukraine has its own long-range missiles. Among them are the Flamingo, with a reported range of about 3,000 kilometers, and the so-called Long Neptune, the first image of which may have lit up quite recently. It is assumed that its range is about 1,000 kilometers. Such a range allows Ukraine to strike at the capital of Russia, Moscow, as Russian propagandists like to call the decision-making center. However, Anton Zemliany, a senior analyst at the Ukrainian Center for Security and Cooperation, is sure that such strikes are not advisable. He said this in a commentary to Telegraph. Moscow and its satellite cities have a large number of military installations, but at the same time, it is one of the most protected regions of Russia, on par with Vladimir Putin's dacha in Valdai. This is the reason why Moscow is so rarely attacked. Ukrainian efforts are focused on maximizing the effectiveness of strikes, the expert says. There are many targets on the territory of the Russian Federation that Moscow is unable to cover with its air defenses. For example, the same Ust-Luga, an important facility, but the Russians did not find enough means to cover it. Anton Zemliany says, if a strike on Moscow is planned, such an operation will be multi-level. According to the analyst, the main task is to bypass the Russian echeloned air defense system so that drones and missiles reach their target. This can only be done when there are enough missiles. To strike Moscow, hundreds of drones and dozens of missiles would be needed so that some of them could reach the target. Zemliany gives the example of the strike on the Marino command post in the Kursk region in 2024. Russian air defense forces exhausted drones and only then launched a strike with Storm Shadow Scalp cruise missiles. Let us recall that this was the first case of using such missiles on the territory of the Russian Federation. At that time, there were reports of the deaths of Russian and North Korean soldiers. Recall, Ukraine has unveiled a new Flamingo cruise missile with a claimed range of 3,000 kilometers, which has a powerful potential. If even half of the claimed performance is true, this weapon could inflict serious damage in any European part of Russia. As The Economist writes, the process of putting the missile into mass production took only 9 months, not years or even decades. It is also fascinating that the project was led by a management team that, it is noted, had no previous experience in the defense industry. The appearance of this missile in the midst of difficult peace talks may encourage Vladimir Putin to lay down his arms. The article says,